The Crusades were a series of religious wars fought between Christians and Muslims, which began in the late 11th century and continued into the 12th and 13th centuries. They were primarily fought, although not exclusively, in the Holy Land, which is the birthplace of Christianity and an important site for pilgrimage. One of the most common misconceptions about the Crusades is that they were solely motivated by greed and religious bigotry. However, this is not true. The Crusades were a response to earlier Islamic conquests, which included Arab conquests of the 7th and 8th centuries and Turkic conquests from the 11th century onwards. These invasions had brought much of the Christian Middle East, North Africa, Spain, Portugal, Armenia, Anatolia, and Cyprus under Muslim control. Approximately two-thirds of the total Christian civilization of that era was occupied by Islamic forces. Christians felt a strong sense of obligation to protect the Holy Land and its holy sites and even their Eastern Christian brothers from the Islamic invaders. It was the leadership of Eastern Christianity that requested help from the Roman Catholic Church and Western Christians against Islamic aggressors when the Seljuk Turks from present-day Turkmenistan invaded Byzantine-controlled Christian Anatolia and continued marching towards Constantinople, the capital of Eastern Christianity and the Byzantine Empire. It was in this context of a helpless and desperate moment, the Eastern Christians requested help, that later resulted in the Crusades. There were many other factors that influenced the Crusades, including attacks on Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land by Muslims. Besides the Christian lands that were completely occupied by Islamic forces, Islamic raids continued on the southern coasts of other European nations such as France, Italy, Greece, and South Slavic nations. These attacks were carried out mainly through sea routes, and millions of European Christians living in coastal towns and villages were abducted and sold into slavery. Among them, small boys were forcefully converted, sometimes even castrated, and girls were sold in open markets as sex slaves, similar to the actions of modern-day jihadist groups like ISIS. Most people might have heard about Nadia Murad in her autobiography, The Last Girl, which is a heartbreaking traumatic account of her capture and enslavement as a sex slave by the Islamic State. However, it is crucial to note that throughout Middle Ages, countless girls had suffered similar atrocities, which was even worse than Nadia's experience. During the Islamic raids into Europe, the scale of sexual slavery was staggering, with tens of thousands of Christian girls being abducted each year, among them many had not even reached puberty. Tragically, this practice, which was not only tolerated but also sanctioned by state and religious authorities in the Islamic world, led to a widespread and guiltless perpetration of these heinous acts. Since this is a very vast topic, we will be presenting this topic as a series, and this video is just an introduction to our series, The Crusades, Myth and Reality. A common myth among the liberal community is that early Islamic rulers were highly tolerant towards Christians, and it was the Crusades which sowed the seeds of hatred and violence. But this is also another urban myth, and we will dedicate an entire subseries within this series for debunking the myth of early Islamic tolerance. Another misunderstanding about the Crusades is that they were a form of European imperialism, with the Crusaders seeking to conquer and colonize Muslim lands. However, this is also not true. The territories liberated by the Crusaders include regions which are part of present-day Israel, Palestine, Lebanon, coastal areas of Turkey and Syria, which even includes Antioch, the cradle of early Christianity. Although the early Islamic invaders were able to quickly Islamize Christian regions of North Africa such as Morocco, Algeria and Tunisia, such a quick Islamization didn't take place in the Mediterranean coast of West Asia, where Christians were densely populated and better organized and were even financially strong enough to pay the discriminatory jizya tax. But even these Christians were reduced to the status of dhimmi or second-class citizens, and the persecutions even began to increase when the Christian demographics began to shrink in these regions. Since the territories occupied by the Crusaders were on the Mediterranean coast of West Asia, these regions had almost a Christian majority during the time of Crusades, therefore majority of the inhabitants of these lands didn't see the Crusaders as invaders but instead as liberators. So the Crusades are in reality more similar to the Spanish Reconquista, in which the Iberian Peninsula, which includes Spain and Portugal, was liberated after centuries of Islamic rule. Many of the Reconquista wars were also part of the Crusades, therefore it's not true that the entire Crusades were a failure, although many of the wars in this series was a failure. The famous 1147 siege of Lisbon, in which port city of Lisbon got liberated after centuries of Arab rule, was actually a part of the Second Crusade. The liberation of the Iberian Peninsula was a significant milestone in the history of Christianity's resistance against jihad. As the Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople, they severed all trade routes to Europe. This left Europe in a state of isolation, surrounded on all sides by Islamic forces. In response to this dire situation, explorers from Spain and Portugal sought out and discovered new sea-based trade routes. Critics of the Crusades often point to the brutal tactics used by the Crusaders, such as the massacre of civilians in Jerusalem in 1099. However, it is important to remember that these actions were not unique to the Crusaders. Both sides in the conflict engaged in similar tactics, and the violence of the Crusades should be seen in the context of the brutal warfare of the time. It is also important to note that the Crusades were not a one-sided conflict. It was the Muslim armies who first started the invasions and engaged in acts of brutal violence and conquest. Although war crimes are even common in modern warfare, the Church has never tried to justify it. Although the Crusades were declared by the Pope, the army was trained and commanded by the secular authorities, and these troops, especially when gone to distant lands, were out of the reach of papacy due to the communication gap, and these troops had sometimes engaged in brutal warfare not authorized by the papacy and sometimes even attacked fellow Christians. However, the Church didn't try to justify these brutal actions of the Crusaders, and several popes had apologized for the mistakes and war crimes committed by the Crusaders, even though it was the secular authorities who commanded these armies and papacy didn't have direct responsibility for it. However, it is important to note that Pope didn't condemn the entire crusade but only the mistakes and war crimes done by the Crusaders. When Pope John Paul II apologized in the year 2000 for the mistakes done by the Crusaders, the radical left and Islamists used it as a golden opportunity to demonize the Christians, especially Catholics. Even though the papacy didn't have direct responsibility for the wrong actions done by the Crusaders commanded by the secular authorities, the apology made by the Pope only shows the piousness and virtue of Christians. On the other hand, Islamists and leftists have not even bothered to make apologies for their past and ongoing mistakes, including brutal jihad by Islamists and large-scale massacres done by leftist regimes, which were once endorsed, even by the leftists living in democratic nations. Although many people of today criticize the Church for having declared a crusade in the past, however, the people of contemporary era used to criticize the papacy for being late to declare a crusade, because the First Crusade began only in 1095. Which is 460 years after the first Christian city was overrun by Muslim armies. 458 years after Antioch, the cradle of early Christianity, was conquered by Muslim armies. 457 years after the Holy Land, including Jerusalem, was conquered by Muslim armies. 453 years after Christian Egypt was taken by Muslim armies. 443 years after Muslims plundered Italy. 427 years after Muslim armies laid first siege to the eastern Christian capital of Constantinople. 380 years after Spain was conquered by Muslim armies. 363 years after France was first attacked by Muslim armies. 249 years after the capital of the Christian world, Rome itself, was sacked by a Muslim army. By the time the Crusades finally began, Muslim armies had already conquered two-thirds of the Christian world, and many of the historic great cathedrals were destroyed or converted into mosques. To put things in perspective, imagine the outrage if a non-Muslim army invades Mecca. However, in this case, it wasn't just one city, but almost all the historic heritage cities of Christianity were invaded by the Islamic forces. In our upcoming series, we will delve deeply into these topics and, as it is a controversial topic, we will present the content with proper authentic references.